So my name is Lynsey Jones. I'm Senior Climate Programme Manager here at SEN, and we've got a fantastic panel with us here today. So before we dive into the panellists, I'm just going to set out what the panel is going to be on. So British Conservatives have taken bold action to tackle climate change, including enshrining net zero by 2050 in law. And hopefully this panel will discuss to what degree the government should be intervening in the economy in order to deliver net zero, and which climate policies best fit with a conservative view of the world. So, panellists, we have got Simon Clarke, MP for Middlesbrough and East Cleveland. We've got Anouka Dhadda, former number 10 head of net zero and energy and now co-founder of Zeroism. We've got Sebastian Payne, director at Onward, and finally we have Sam Peacock, Director of Corporate Affairs and Strategy at SSE, who are kindly sponsoring this panel. So we're going to start with 3 minutes of introductory remarks, and then we'll go to a Q&A with the audience. Just a reminder for the usual spiel, please use #NetZeroAge and tag @sen_HQ. So first up, we have Simon. Over to you.
Super. Well, thank you, Lynsey, and good afternoon, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, talking about what is, in many ways, I think, the most important question that we face, which is the how we deliver net zero in this country. And I think that goes to the heart of whether it will succeed, because we do obviously face two routes that we could go down. We could go down a market-aligned version of net zero, one which works in the consumer interest and in government's interest to make what is a colossally expensive and challenging project as feasible, as quickly deliverable and as cheaply deliverable as possible, or what could be described as the big state version, whereby the government tries to do everything and probably does it rather badly and very slowly, and we lose public support in the process. And this really, for me, is why it's so important that conservative environmentalists are in this debate. The debate about whether or not we're doing net zero, I believe, is largely won. There will always be challenges in that journey, but it is largely, I think, a settled journey. But the mechanisms are all there to fight for. Now, there are some very short-term practical challenges, so I would urge you to make your voices heard in the ongoing consultation, for example, about how we deliver our new commitment to liberating onshore wind, which is a really important breakthrough, and one which I want to pay great tribute to SEN and to Sam Hall as its director for helping to deliver that, because that is a terrific victory and an early example, I think, of the kind of breakthroughs we're going to want to see. But more broadly, it's my view that we need to focus on those enabling mechanisms which will really drive this. So, for example, planning reform. We need to make sure that we can get the infrastructure that's required, the grid capacity that's going to be needed, built out as quickly and as cheaply as possible. That's a good example where the state can be a really positive force to enable private companies to get in there and to deliver the change that we all need to see. At the moment, our planning system is, frankly, not fit for purpose. That has major ramifications for the cost and the timescale of key projects, and we should be acting on that to make sure that we are match fit as a country and that we can capitalise on the opportunities that we know that we have. We also need to avoid, I think, getting drawn into an outright subsidy race, which we can't win, particularly versus the Americans, and that therefore places a double premium on us being a really good and competitive place in which to do business. If you're an energy firm, if you're looking to take forward the next stride, be it in hydrogen, carbon capture, onshore, offshore wind, new nuclear, we need to be on your side. There is, I think, also a role for the state as an enabling partner, and I see this very clearly up on Teesside, where the Teesside Mayoralty is an absolutely key partner in delivering key programmes like Net Zero Teesside, and all the clean technologies I referenced a moment ago are part of that equation, part of that policy mix. We're about making sure that the sites are ready and cleared and available for companies to move in. It's incredibly exciting what is therefore being unlocked, and Ben Houchin, as our Conservative Mayor, is working alongside absolute giants, likes of BP, Equinor, Shell, to turn what are really world-leading projects into a reality, and that is, I think, a really good demonstration of where the levelling up agenda marries up with the environmental agenda as well. So there's an awful lot more, I think, that we'll tease out during the course of this panel, but I would say get the planning right, avoid getting drawn into a subsidy race, and make sure that wherever possible, local communities and local leaders are working to support the big giants of private commerce who will hopefully actually deliver a lot of this. That's all the things we need to be focused on over the course of the next few years.
Brilliant, wonderful. So Sam, I'm going to come over to you next.
Brilliant, thanks. And Simon, I'm going to end up echoing quite a few of your comments, which is good, because it's good that we're pretty aligned. I mean, from my perspective, we want Britain to be really the easiest place in the world to invest in clean electricity. We want to be able to harness what Chris Skidmore called the growth opportunity of the 21st century. Now, for SSE, this is obviously enlightened self-interest. We're building more offshore wind than anyone else in the world right now, and we want to invest 24 billion in the UK. So we want it easier so we can do more. But it's also of actually fundamental importance to bill payers, because there are huge cost savings of making things simple and less risky. We actually calculated with an economics company, LCP, that if you add 1% of risk onto investments or 1% onto the cost of capital, it'll make net zero 50 billion more expensive. So I agree with Simon. I don't think the UK can throw money at the problem. I don't think we can replicate what the US's IRA has done. I think we need to box clever to succeed. I've got 4 super quick ingredients of what's in boxing clever for me. One, it's actually having a bunch of believable targets that investors can believe in. We did that for offshore wind. I think we're behind on CCUS and hydrogen in terms of ambition there, but we managed to do it for offshore wind, and then you can get the supply chain behind it, repeatability, etc. That's how some of the costs have come down. Simon mentioned it, but grid needs to be as easy for grid to get built and as easy as possible for developers to connect to it. That basically means a mindset shift in the regulator around allowing more anticipatory investment through. And then thirdly, you need to make sure that market mechanisms are really simple. Simon's government did brilliantly, and Anouka as well, in terms of the CFD, which is the instrument for investing in offshore wind. We need simple mechanisms like that for people to keep investing in, so we should evolve them in a way that's investor friendly. And finally, again, Simon mentioned it, so I'm nicking your lines, or you nick mine, one or the other, but consenting needs to be far quicker. It can take 10 years to do an offshore wind farm from start to end, similar for major power lines. That's too long for what we need to do. So I'm an optimist, because nothing that Simon said or I've said is impossible. It's perfectly possible. Britain's got a great head start in its positioning, but we're going to have a bit of work to do to keep boxing clever and staying ahead. So that's all I'd say, Lynsey.
Brilliant. There are definitely some themes coming through here. And over to Seb next.
Thank you very much. And just to make this a nice consensual panel, I agree with everything that's been said by the two before us. So obviously the big thing that we focus on at Onward is levelling up. That's our main programme of work. And I think one thing we need to get better at is putting the language of levelling up and net zero together. That we found that, the net zero transition is going to create about 1.7 million new jobs. About half of them would be in the Midlands, the North, and in Scotland, and many of those places that have struggled through the deindustrialisation area, because the proportion of jobs in the UK that are classed as industrial has gone from about 28% to 9.2%. And we're obviously about to hit this big moment where we've got opportunity to reindustrialise. And I think as Conservatives, we need to focus more on the language of reindustrialisation, of jobs, of skills, of economic security in terms of what net zero is going to bring. Because, Simon, you were saying about the fight almost being won. I agree with that, but it is not entirely won yet. And there are still people within the Conservative movement who come across on the climate sceptical wing of it, because they talk about the cost and the effort of getting to net zero, which, as everyone in this room knows, is complete rubbish, because the fact is the cheapest forms of energy are renewable forms of energy now. And that's something that we cannot say enough for people trying to win the argument for the right in terms of net zero. And then when we go back to the levelling up piece in terms of the kind of jobs you get from net zero, they are higher skilled, they are higher wage, and they are going to be long-term jobs as well. And all those parts of the country that need help the most, this is how we should be trying to sell it there. Now, in terms of how we get there, we've obviously got to get the balance right between what the government does and what the private sector does. And those who followed the travails and the ups and downs of British Vault will be completely aware of the dangers of what happens when you get this wrong. You know, this will hopefully have a very happy ending. But you saw central government getting very enthusiastic about this plant in Blythe in Northumberland, because obviously thousands of new jobs, millions, if not billions of pounds investment, something that can sustain the British car industry for many years into the future. And yet the business plan wasn't there. The infrastructure wasn't there. The people were not in the right place, and the whole thing collapsed and left everyone with egg on their faces. And when I was reading the report from the Australia conglomerate that's taken over it, they're saying we don't even in fact have the skills to make this a success. But what we do think is we can lay the blueprint from what the administrators have picked up to take it somewhere else. So when you look at that, I think that's a very good example of where government should and should not get involved. I think if it is going to be involved, it needs to be very strategic and focused on core infrastructure, not necessarily just backing individual projects that can be winners on this, because, you know, we've got to make sure that you've got the right incentives in terms of business rate, in terms of planning, as Simon was saying as well, that, you know, over the next decade, we're going to have huge amounts of stuff that are going to need to be built over this. I think it's about half of green manufacturing floors will have to have their infrastructure built by about 2030. So we need to be getting this right now, and we need to be much better with our planning system right now. And I know people like Simon have campaigned on this, not entirely with success, but the battle is not over, and we'll still continue to be fought in the right way. But I do think there is an area where we need to have the right government incentives to ensure that people are investing in the places that have got the right geographic location, the natural resources and the skills base and the infrastructure on that. The other third thing at Onward that we are very enthusiastic in about all this, of course, is devolution. And I think you mentioned Ben Houchin in Tees Valley being an example of someone who's really lent into the renewable agenda and trying to encourage investment. The GE plant there is an example of that. Also the carbon capture schemes. But it doesn't necessarily require Metro Mayor. You know, one of the most, I always think, was successful examples is what we saw in Hull with the turbine factory, and that was made at the very end of the Labour government by Gordon Brown and Peter Mandelson. Now, that is a huge success, and it can't keep up with the amount of demand that's required for offshore wind turbines. So I think you've got to have strong local leadership who can figure out what particular parts of the country can contribute to the net zero agenda, because as we mentioned in Northumberland, there's a good example of a place that can do battery manufacturing. So you've got the big Nissan plant down in Sunderland. On the Humber, you've got offshore wind. There's going to be different parts in other areas of the country, and I don't necessarily want central government to prescribe X should be doing Y, because you get into very much a planned labour strategy and industrial strategy, and I don't think that's going to work. What you need is local leaders identifying what those areas have, where they can have the skills, and where they can encourage the right business investment. But ultimately, you know, why does net zero matter to Conservatives? It's prosperity we've just been talking about. It's equalising opportunity. It's reindustrialisation. But also it's the language of security that time and time again we're talking about economic security, energy security. Net zero is core to both of those things, and I think the way we talk and think about it has to move in that direction. And we at Onward were delighted to see the new Department of Net Zero and Energy Security brought in under Grant Shapps, that it's better than the ODEC in terms of that it's focused on, you know, the fact that we've had a pretty rubbish energy security policy for the past couple of decades, and someone does really need to urgently fix that. But we are going to have some turbulence, I think, over the next 18 months over this, because there will be many people who are not on board with the net zero agenda pushing in the wrong direction, saying we need to fire up the power stations, do X, do Y. What we've argued at Onward is that we have to be pragmatic in our approach on this. That, you know, when we hit the events at the end of last year, we argued, you know, there is a circumstance where you do need to fire up fossil fuel-fired power stations to get us through this moment. Because if we take an absolutist approach in the short term, we do risk of losing the wider argument. But in the medium term, we can and will be vindicated. I'm very excited to see what will be in the next Conservative manifesto, and I'm sure Onward will be trying to get its ideas in there, as will many other people. But net zero was a core part of 2019. It will definitely be a core part of 2024. And I think the foundations and language are all in the right place. We've got to make sure we know who we're focusing on what the prize is.
Gosh, lots there to draw out, hopefully, in the Q&A. But before we move on to that, finally over to Anouka.
Thanks. I'll pick up from Seb then, because I think jobs and investment are at the heart of this. And, you know, it is reinvigorating our nation. But I won't kind of labour what Seb just said, because actually I think there's a kind of broader bit which we have, which is first mover advantage, kind of globally. So actually, you know, look at China, for example. They're building out coal power stations, yeah, definitely, but they're also kind of massively building off their offshore wind, electric vehicles, because there's money to be made here, right? There's a global market. And I think we've kind of moved away from this, yeah, but India and China aren't doing anything, so should we? Because we're seeing, like, the US put 375 billion into this. We're seeing China kind of expand. And actually our COP26 in Glasgow did a huge amount to kind of move us towards global net zero, which actually is like everyone kind of on the same page about this. I think at the heart of this, though, is about kind of technology. So kind of what does the route look like? Well, actually, you know, humans, I believe, in natural innovators, but actually we also know that there's a bit of a gap between kind of ideas and action. So when you ask people, are they up for doing something, they'll say yes, but when it comes to it, there is always that lag. And so actually what technology allows us to do is kind of make the transition as seamless and frictionless as possible for those people. So, you know, if you're not necessarily going to be minded to stop flying because you like a holiday, well, actually, can we kind of accelerate the use of sustainable aviation fuel to try and overcome that? So what's quite important in thinking about the route in particular is also kind of acknowledging that there are things we know and things we don't know. The thing that I always used to find about modelling is that we always know that it will definitely be wrong. You're just trying to kind of assume by how much and kind of what's the best path. And so actually kind of that's where kind of having this kind of technological bets and kind of thinking about where are the gaps and kind of where can we flex on it is super important. I think the other bit of this is obviously private sector finance and the role of the private sector. So, you know, what is it that government can do that no one else can? Well, government can set regulations and frameworks and headline ambitions. The private sector have cash. Obviously, like the government should support the bit that's kind of hardest to do. So how do you get over that kind of initial hurdle where you're kind of trying to get your early adopters to take it up and kind of bring down the cost so you can get widespread adoption? But ultimately, you know, and this, I'm a former Treasury official before I was in number 10 for 5 years. So actually kind of, you know, I know that there are fiscal trade-offs that you're always making. And so actually when you're thinking about where does that kind of marginal pound best get spent, quite often it's, well, if it's cheap enough, you kind of assume economics takes over from that point. And actually, it's companies that have to deliver this in reality, right? And that's partly why I left government, to set up a kind of firm that would help companies with their transition plans, because actually it's now in the boardrooms. They're the ones that have to actually enact these great things that we sit around in Glasgow boardrooms and kind of come up with together. And I think that's kind of where we're seeing this year in particular kind of take us. So what does kind of the next 18 months in particular need to look like? Well, actually, there's a bit about kind of making the UK the best place to like invest and grow a business, and also kind of the best place to live. So on that kind of investment point, actually, there's some kind of big regulatory or kind of framework bits around kind of setting a taxonomy. So what do we consider to be green investment? How are we financing it through kind of our infrastructure bank, etc. But also kind of using outfits like our Office for Investment to actually bring in the companies and support them to actually kind of help us then export this technology, because those jobs are then here, but we're kind of selling to the rest of the world. And then in kind of being the best place to live, well, I think kind of a huge kind of, I don't want to use the word legacy because, you know, it's not done yet, but actually kind of having a big kind of nuclear program in particular potentially really helps us kind of with our energy security. So actually we're kind of saying, fine, we're using power, but, you know, we're kind of cleaning it up and bringing back nuclear and bringing nuclear home, as we kind of called it. But as has kind of been mentioned by a few people on this panel, actually the grid is probably the single thing that kind of underpins us all. And it's a bit of a kind of hidden secret because we don't really talk about it. But I think if we can collectively come up with an interesting way of kind of getting grid to be upgraded as quickly as we need to, then we can kind of have this ambition and net zero on the right path.
Wonderful. Before we go to Q&A, I'm going to use Chair's prerogative. We've talked about the kind of manifesto. It's been mentioned a few times about the next 18 months. What does the Prime Minister have a position, a credible position on net zero? Does he have the same kind of narrative perspective on net zero in the way that perhaps previous prime ministers have done? And in the next manifesto, how big do you think climate is going to feature, bearing in mind we've got a huge amount of other global issues to kind of grapple with? So I'd like to hear a few words just from each panellist, if that's all right, before we head on over to Q&A. So I'll maybe throw this over to Simon first.
Well, the short answer is I think Rishi does have a very credible position on climate issues, and that's partly a matter of inheritance, that actually, all of the Conservative governments of the last 13 years, I think, have got a track record to be genuinely proud of. And, you contrast the situation in 2010 when we, first returned to power with today. It is transformational. We have a wholly new set of industries which we have fostered, and we heard reference from Sam to innovative mechanisms for financing like contracts for difference, which have acted superbly to make sure that we deliver this, as I set out in my opening remarks, at the lowest possible cost to the taxpayer. And indeed, those CFDs are now in a position where we're starting to see money returned from increasingly profitable offshore wind developments. And that is a hallmark of our success. I know he gets this in a wider sense as well. Rishi is an innovator, and he's someone who understands markets better perhaps than any Conservative of my lifetime since Thatcher. He is a Conservative economist to his fingertips, and he will want to see us deliver on a programme which works in this way. And he, I think, will always, in the end, be very conscious of the what's the bottom line question, and that is, I think, why it's so important that we can deliver this in a way which stacks up.
Yeah.
And his Treasury instincts can be harnessed for good ends in this debate, rather than to foster the Treasury says no, which is always the risk, right? That it's some of these projects do require leaps of faith. They are harder on the face of it than just sticking with conventional sources of power. It does take leadership to change that and to show the scale of the opportunity that exists. I'm confident that we will, in the manifesto, set out a very exciting package for the next 5 years.
Anouka, I mean, you were very involved in Former Number 10. What do you think to current?
I mean, I'll state the obvious, he has a very different style, right, to Boris Johnson. But, I mean, also, I think he has shown already some kind of movement on this agenda, which is quite positive. So, for example, on energy efficiency, which is actually kind of, as we all know, kind of a huge bit to kind of try and tackle. And there's rumour of a kind of upcoming net zero moment. So I think we have to kind of see what is delivered, but high hopes.
Okay. Sam, when it comes to business, what do you think?
The ones that are taken actually by Seb's point earlier around couching a lot of the stuff in energy security, because the solutions for net zero are the same solutions that you have for energy security. One stat for you, if we'd met the government's 2030 renewable targets by 2020, in 2021 at the end, we'd have saved 30 billion in gas. So that gives you a common sense reality on the economics of that. So I think he's going to have to do some of the boring stuff, though. It's all about planning, it's about grid. This stuff maybe doesn't win you elections, but it will actually get you closer to net zero.
Wonderful. Seb, final thoughts before Q&A.
I think, obviously, Rishi Sunak is very much grounded in detail and reality as a person who sort of does these things. So I think whereas some other prime ministers enjoy soaring rhetoric and big ideals and visions, that's not Rishi Sunak's way that he governs things. So I think his language will be much more tempered than I think you will have seen in the past about this. But I don't think that's just the ambition is at all, because ultimately Rishi Sunak was Chancellor for sort of 3 years or so. And as you said, the numbers speak to where it is, where the net zero debate is. And I think that is the most single powerful thing. But as I talked about before, I think when you look about trying to add some meat to levelling up, when it actually looks like there is nothing more tangible than what you are seeing across many different parts of the country in terms of factories, in terms of jobs, in terms of skills. Like, they are really good, tangible things. And I think at a time when the Conservative Party is looking for some more of those things at the next election, there's pretty much nothing out there as good as net zero to try and do that. I think in terms of the kind of overall goals, you are right in a way, Simon, is, we know where we're going. We know what we need to do. We know roughly how to get there. It is just a case of doing it now and making sure we can deliver on it. And that's quite difficult when you come towards a manifesto, because manifestos are trying to give you a framework for what you can sell to voters, but then govern on the other side of that. So I think ultimately, I can imagine there will be some interesting new stuff. You know, for example, one area we're going to be exploring at Onward is community benefit and how that could work, because there is going to be a huge amount of infrastructure that's required, and that will hit upon planning issues. There's no doubt about it. If you go to certain Tory MPs and say you're going to have 50 massive new pylons built in your constituency, you can imagine how many of them are going to reflect that. So when we are looking at this national ambition for net zero, we've got to make sure that A, Conservative MPs are on the journey with it. And as I said, I think overwhelmingly they are. But they just need to make sure that everyone's feeling they're getting the right way, but make sure it's working well for communities. That's kind of where I see the debates going there. And just to go to the nuclear point that was being made as well, that is absolutely crucial towards the net zero debate as well. That it's astounding when you think about the lead that Britain had in nuclear power in the 60s and 70s. And I spoke to Lord Waldegrave about this, who was energy minister under Margaret Thatcher, and he said it was one of the biggest mistakes we've made in British post-war history, that we basically lost our lead on nuclear power. With these small modular reactors, with the plans we've got in place now, we have got opportunities to get back on the front foot. Once again, that is going to take some level of trust, particularly from the Treasury, to put money into these projects. But I don't see how we get to net zero without making massive progress on that. So I think, you know, it was in his dying days of his government, Tony Blair pledged 10 new nuclear power stations. I don't know how many have been built now, but I assume the answer is 0. But, you know, that kind of shows how long we've been kicking this around. And if you want to feel infuriated, as I often do with the Liberal Democrats, then you should see the video that Nick Clegg said that if we built new nuclear power stations, can you believe they will not be online until 2021? Can you believe that? And that was in 2010. So what I don't want to see is any more of those videos happening again from ministers at the moment, instead in 10 years' time, actually have the damn things built.
Here, here.
Right, okay, so we've got a few roving mics. I'll take a few questions at a time, and as always, please keep it to a question, not a statement. And we'll try to get through as many as possible. So Finn, there's a few here. One gentleman, Helena, and there's 3 in a row there, Finn.
My question's for Simon. I'm the chairman of Epsom Conservatives. When you say planning reform and everybody nods sagely, I think of Cheshire and Amersham. How do we sell planning reform on the doorsteps in May?
Lovely short question. This gentleman in front, and then Helena. There's 3 there.
Thank you. Michael from Business Green. As Sam set out at the start of the conference, part of this about having a response to Labour's 28 billion public investment. Obviously, Conservatives are keen on a kind of private investment, crowding and private investment. With that in mind, we've seen vast oil and gas profits over the last month, and obviously, a huge amount of their capex is, not going to renewables and not going to green energy, even despite the windfall tax. So how, what's the government going to do to try and bring in that investment? How do they justify that kind of green interventionist or that kind of investment-driven approach when, even the windfall tax isn't bringing that in?
Okay.
Hiya, Helena Horton from The Guardian. This is for Simon. So you had the government to account on onshore wind, and I think you would admit that the lack of action perhaps has added money to our energy bills. Do you think that the Conservative government holds any responsibility at all for how high energy bills are? And also, do you think that blaming the 2010 Labour government is going to hold any water with voters when that was such a long time ago?
Okay, we've got quite a lot there aimed at Simon, so I'm going to try and just a little bit, just to make sure that everyone else gets a say. So, Simon, I will come to you first. There are a few things there. There was how to sell planning reform, seeing as you're such a big proponent. And perhaps you could touch on the energy bill point, which I'd like to come back to later about interventionist versus free market politics. But if you start us off with those 2, and then I'll come to
the MP's prerogative. But look, on planning reform, I think we have to distinguish this from the wider question of building the homes that we need, which is often the main focus of that particular debate. Now, I do believe very strongly that it is important for the Conservative Party to win the argument, actually with our own voters, about the importance of building more homes for the next generation. And there are, a litany of reports out at the moment showing how we are artificially breaking the market in that regard, and needlessly doing so in a way which I think will haunt us for generations to come. But that is distinct, and that argument is distinct from the point that I'm making here, which is about the narrow issue of speeding up planning for those big infrastructure projects, those big grid adaptations in particular, which are going to be required in terms of the connectivity to link up, for example, vast offshore wind farms with the national grid, or indeed to make sure that we can get new power stations up and running where they're needed. Those are narrower battles, I think more readily winnable battles, because often they won't be near areas of high population. And I do think that we just need to underscore to people who will undoubtedly suffer disbenefit that there are compensating benefits, which is why I think community benefit, which we touched on a moment ago, is a really important dynamic for think tanks like Onward to be fleshing out, because we do want to be making sure that if you are one of the people who has their sight lines damaged by new technology, that there is something in it for you. And I think that's a big part of the way to win the argument on onshore wind. Very fleeting on oil and gas profits. I mean, I think the critical thing on that is we're still going to need oil and gas as a transition fuel. Sorry, I was speaking to Business Green first, sorry, and then I'll... I think on that point, we just need to be realistic that we have still got 30 years to hit our net zero targets, and there is no conceivable route where we don't need oil and gas. That sector does already pay double the main rate of corporation tax, and we are imposing windfall tax. We have to be very careful not to jeopardise the additional investment that we are going to need to see from them over the next 30 years. Helena, to your point on bills, look, I think the UK has a story to be proud of here. You know, if you look at the percentage of our total energy generated by clean electricity, on most days now, that is about a third of our total need, sometimes higher than that, and that is a real achievement. I don't think that this is a particularly politicised field, the issue of whether our energy policy has been right or wrong. The truth is that I think governments of both colours have made mistakes and been too short-termist in their approach. And I think what Seb was saying about, Lord Waldegrave's reflections on this is fundamentally right. Neither party built the energy infrastructure that we really needed during the 1990s and 2000s, and that is a collective failure, which not only means that we're facing more costs now, but it has also, I'm afraid, increased the damaging consequences of what Putin's done and how hard we found it to divest ourselves of Russian oil and gas.
We've heard how important private investment is. Sam, I wonder if you could touch on the point about crowding in private investment and the kind of tax framework around that we've seen.
Just one comment, really, and I won't build on what I said earlier, because it's not very interesting to repeat itself, but the oil and gas profits are exponentially bigger than what you've seen in renewables, yet bizarrely for there's a kind of investment allowances opt-out almost to some extent in oil and gas, which you're not seeing in the renewables tax, which I think is odd and actually gives the wrong kind of signals to people, I think, in this country. Just from SC's perspective, no problem paying taxes at all, actually. We ought to be contributing more and more to society for some of the things we've all been talking about, but we do need them to be fair across different technologies.
Mm-hmm. I suppose a little bit on planning reform, Anouka. You've been in the heart of government, and you've seen how all of this stuff is developed. There's a difference between developing it in government and then selling it out on the doorstep to your constituents or ward members. How do you think that sometimes translates between either planning reform or Treasury, net zero? How does that work?
I think the community benefits piece is the kind of bit to come back on that, really, and it's something we built into the British energy security strategy as well, because we see companies like Octopus, for example, who are already trialling this. So if you live near an onshore wind turbine, I think it's when it's generating, you pay half the cost as you would do otherwise. So it's like, you can see the material difference, and I think that's something that we need to increasingly do. I think there's just on a couple of other points, the thing that's also really clear to me is that we need to try and ensure that we're bringing out the tangible kind of outcomes for people. And so, someone mentioned the kind of Labour 28 billion, great, and like big numbers are always great, and you're always in the market to try and find them, but on the doorstep. People want to know, well, what does this mean for kind of my area and my life? And I think that translation is what's going to be really, really important, which again is where something like community benefits has a real kind of direct impact. And then the final point I would just make is that actually, just because we should always bring it back to leveraging private sector finance, it turns out on a SEN panel, but actually this point about leveraging private sector finance actually does help kind of. So what we as government have done is, certainly under my time, we invested 30 billion of public finances in to leverage 100 billion of private finance, and it's that kind of like multiplier that I think is quite important. So we can argue how much that state figure should be, but I think it's that multiplier that's actually the thing to discuss.
Mm-hmm. And finally, from that kind of that round of questions, Seb, I wonder if you could touch on the kind of energy bill point. And that we've seen government policy is to help out bill payers with a lot of money, essentially. Does that fit with a Conservative view?
Well, I mean, conservatism above all else is pragmatism to the situations that you find yourself in. I mean, there's very few Conservatives who get out of bed in the morning about piling direct subsidies into the private sector. I don't know if you do, Simon, but I doubt it somehow. So, I mean, no one's exactly happy or enthused by it, but it was what the circumstances required. In the same way in the pandemic, furlough was what was required, and it was the right thing to do in all those circumstances, because the alternative would have been far worse in that situation. But ultimately, it is about moving to a situation as rapidly and sustainably as possible where we don't have to do that. It's not going to be quick, it's not going to be easy, but the alternative is just not thinkable in any respect on that. Just to touch on another point very quickly to you, sir, about planning reform and how you deal with it. I mean, the fact is, I think planning reform is coming one way or another. That if Labour wins the next election, they will almost certainly do planning reform. And I think, we have got ourselves into the situation where you can't change anything about the system. And I think if the good voters of Cheshire and Amersham don't like Conservative planning reform, they're not going to particularly love a Labour idea of planning reform either. So I think that's the kind of situation we have got ourselves into. It's not about just concreting over our green and pleasant land, but it's about finding a way that works better for where we need it. And to go back to the research we've done at Onward, in terms of where the infrastructure is going to be required, it is places that want more building, that want more jobs, that want more infrastructure. So going back to Tees Valley, if you look at what's happening in Teesport there, they're actively welcoming, want to build more much quicker, and would welcome having liberalised planning reforms. And somebody asked about Labour and the £28 billion of their package they've put forward. I think one thing you often get in the net zero debate is these big, huge figures that either can make some people very excited but scare off other people as well. And I mean, that £28 billion figure, I can't for life of me imagine that will be a part of the Conservatives' next general election campaign, to ask where that money's coming from, where exactly is it going to be spent, and how useful it's going to be. So I think this comes back to my original thing about language, about how we do this. When we're talking about the opportunities of net zero, we want to be as ambitious as possible. When we're talking about how we get there, we need to be grounded in reality of the technology we have and the opportunities we have at this particular moment.
Wonderful. Right, a few more questions. Finn, there's two gentlemen there.
Hi, Thomas Mason. I work for the BBC, but here on a personal capacity. Just wondering, Seb, you mentioned there about the cost of some of Labour's pledges. Labour does seem to have some ambition in this area. They're talking about great British energy, a state-owned company on the scale of EDF. That seems to have some substance behind it. I'm just wondering if a Conservative route to net zero, a bit like a Conservative route to levelling up. It's a good slogan, but is there enough, sufficient energy, sufficient money going in to make it happen? Otherwise, we say, Rishi's being good on efficiency and insulation or something. But it does, and there are, of course, all these things about connecting stuff up. But you do need a real push on this. And does a Conservative route have the big vision as well as some of those incremental improvements?
Mm-hmm. There's a gentleman just behind you.
Hi, it's Adam Vaughan here from The Times. It's a question for Simon, but I'd also be interested in the other panellists' view. Next month, the government has to issue a revised net zero strategy. I wondered, what would you most like to see in that? And related to the other gentleman's question, on zero carbon electricity, the Conservatives are being outbid by Labour, promising zero carbon by 2030 rather than 25. Does that worry you? And what's your answer to that?
We'll take one more, Finn. Pick one that's nearby. Oh, yep, Brendan, yep.
Hi, I'm Brendan from SSC. I work for Sam, so I'm definitely not going to put him on the spot. So my question is for Simon and Anouka, sort of respective former Treasury Minister and Treasury official. So in addition to our sort of significant offshore wind pipeline, we're also looking to develop CCS and hydrogen. And something we need from the Treasury is a bit more ambition and initial support to help sort of get further investment so we can sort of get space in the ground. So it was just to get your perspective on how do we win that argument to overcome that challenge that you've both sort of already referenced, the sort of the Treasury says no, which we've heard energy ministers past and present sort of talk about.
Mm-hmm. Okay, if we could start with perhaps Anouka on that one, then we'll come back down the line to answer some of those questions.
Certainly. So this should be a bingo game because I think part of it is actually private finance. Because why do I think that? It's been really actually interesting being outside of government for the last 5 months because companies that I speak to, actually, if you speak to kind of like financial institutions, there is no shortage of kind of like appetite, and particularly as they see it coming down the road, there is a kind of like, well, what do we put money into? The thing that it keeps on coming back to is like, well, can government set the kind of like framework around this? Like, so we know that it's kind of like de-risking the ask for us. So actually kind of, and this is bringing together a few points, actually that kind of like cross-party kind of consensus is something the UK was quite unique in kind of in driving, right? And actually that helps kind of companies and investments that are potentially quite spooked by, you know, well, is there going to be flip-flopping? I think that's quite an interesting bit in what the US has done, but we don't necessarily kind of need to go on to that. I might just touch on the kind of 2030 point because I think kind of actually the key to that is the grid. It's fine, you can just have me on repeat. But that is actually the thing that will be the kind of key limiting factor. On the net zero strategy, I mean, I think it was very good. So I would do, right? Just make sure you deliver on nuclear. And that also links to the kind of energy point, which is actually we named it Great British Nuclear, right? Bringing back a nuclear capacity. And I think that is the kind of key thing to actually kind of underpinning our energy supplies.
Simon, your thoughts?
Super. Well, on ambition and whether we're matching Labour, I think results speak for themselves, that we are actually delivering very well. And if you look at the polling on this, certainly the last time I looked, the climate and our response, the adequacy of our response to it was actually an area where the Conservatives and Labour were enjoying equal standing. So there isn't a sense, I think, in which, this is an area which traditionally I think would have been dominated by the centre-left. This is a policy area that, rather like defence is for us, they would expect to own. And the fact that they don't is, I think, testament to the fact that we have been innovative and active and visible, although I would completely accept that the narrative around this is critical and emphasising the grandeur of the vision and the magnitude of that vision, and that it's rooted in energy security, national security, more jobs in the places that they're most needed, that this is a transformational national undertaking with direct benefits for many of the communities that need it most, is something that perhaps post-Boris we need to be able to recapture. And this mustn't become, and this is actually true of the wider government's mission, this mustn't become an exercise in technocratic managerialism. We have to make sure that we are capable of inspiring. Adam, you asked about what should go into the net zero strategy. I think probably, what we heard on the panel today would reflect my slightly. It's not meant to be bland because it isn't, but the pragmatic recognition actually there's a lot of just quite technical things we need to do over the next few years to make this policy deliverable. I don't think we should shy away from the fact that having set the ambition, we now need to set a credible pathway to delivery. On whether we can deliver net zero earlier, I think most people would say it is very, very hard for us to do to aspire to net zero in the 2030s. And I think there is also then the point that I was sort of trying to essay out in my opening remarks, which is that if we do this in a way which is perceived as a hair-shirt, punitive exercise, whereby we do have to trade our living standards, our holidays, our ability to travel, our ability to heat our homes, we are going to lose the popular argument, and actually there will be a backlash. Not least, I suspect, on the right of politics against what it will be perceived as an assault on common sense, and so we have to be very careful, I think, not to not to promise more than we can deliver, or certainly not to promise more than we can deliver without compromising what will quite reasonably be expected to be rising living standards. Finally, Brendan, to your point on CCUS and hydrogen, it's incredibly exciting that the groundbreaking at Net Zero Teesside, which will be the first CCUS cluster, will be on the 10th of March, so that is coming up really very soon. We've got the Teesside and HyNet clusters for carbon capture, this fantastic way of making sure that we can put some of the emissions which will inextricably be needed for some technologies. Even after we've moved to net zero on power, there will be lots of technologies which still emit CO2 as a byproduct of production. We need to find new ways of emitting that in a net zero world safely. And I think this is the beginning of what will be a very exciting journey. The next step is to try and get, for example, Project Acorn, the Scottish cluster, up and running, and to scale this and export this technology. Because if we can be, to Anouka's point, a first mover on this, the potential is huge. And it's going to be an important way of demonstrating that the UK can be at the forefront of the opportunities of net zero, as well as, obviously, a country which is prepared to shoulder some of the upfront costs.
Sam, is there enough money going into net zero? Would SSE like some more?
Do you know what? I'll link this to the gentleman from the BBC's point as well. It's like when you think about the Great British Energy thing, and I see Equinor here, who are a sort of national champion from Norway. If Britain seeks to put money into a state company that wants to make another Equinor, it's got a long way to go, and that's going to cost a lot of money. I would be focusing that genre of intervention around market failures and where you're actually not able to attract some of that financial investment, rather than putting after money where there is investment there. And do you mind if I want just take the opportunity to just briefly answer Adam's question, what I most like to see?
Yeah.
On networks, my specific point is it's about allowing anticipatory investment into the regulatory structure, which is hideously complex, but actually quite a simple principle, and it shouldn't be too difficult to crack.
Lovely answer.
Just to come back to your point about the ambition and how it's spoken about. I mean, as I said, by its very nature, people on the Conservative side tend to be more cautious, and they don't kind of go for big utopian projects when they talk about these things, which occasionally net zero can sound about that when you listen to some campaigners and activists about it. So you can understand why people on the right are talking about it in more tempered terms of pragmatism, of economic benefits, of tangibles, as opposed to a kind of vision of a decarbonised society and what it looks like. But I think there is enough kind of pragmatic stuff that we can do that actually builds up to something very positive. That I remember Boris Johnson did an article for the FT when I was working there, where he talked about ambition to become the Saudi Arabia of wind, in very Johnsonian language there. But that is A, very possible, and B, is already happening. So I don't think just because you're talking about it in terms of sums of money, you're not talking about it in a lesser way. And as I said, on the Labour side, it is all about state money we're going to put into it. And to come out to the classic Sen thing, it is all about how much money full stop is going in from the private and public element of this as well. There's one thing I just wanted to touch on that we haven't come across yet already, and that is our nimbleness as a country, that we do have the first move advantage that was being talked about earlier because of our size and because we're already doing relatively well compared to some other Western nations in terms of getting to net zero. We do need to strike the right balance here. I think there are things we can push ahead with faster than other countries. If you take carbon capture and hydrogen, for example, those are both things that are very frequently cited as somewhere the UK could go faster and better. But, for example, trying to kickstart the carbon industry, we had two competitions. One was in 2011 and one was in 2016. They were both scrapped because they didn't really get anywhere and didn't do anything. And, obviously that's not a reason to stop trying to do it, but it is an indicative lesson about how we look and try and appeal towards these sorts of things. And I think there's a hydrogen review at the moment. Have I made that up? No, there's probably another one. But, we want to make sure that we are being as dynamic as we can, and we're speaking a day dominated by Brexit, and as we're hopefully moving on from the backwards and forwards of the 2019 Brexit wars, and we look towards the future, net zero is definitely somewhere where we can take our regulatory advantage to be nimble where it makes sense, and that's kind of what I would like to see more of from government on this. And obviously this is stuff that we look at Onward, but also the policymakers as well.
Right, I think we've got time for another round of a few questions. Finn, pick a few people.
Hi, thank you. I'm very much enjoying today, and you've fulfilled my purpose on coming, which was how do I help convince North Yorkshire County Council to really drive this, drive net zero even harder than we already do. I'm afraid I'm going to sort of resort to a little bit of low tech here. The most efficient carbon capture technology we have in this country is actually a tree. Well, actually, it's a peat bog. Peat bogs actually absorb more CO2 than anything else. About a third, or just under a third, of our emissions come from farming. Farming is 70% of the UK land. If you like modern, it's 19 million hectares. If you like old, that's 47 million acres. This is a real asset we have, and we're not doing any. The debate has not gone there today, and I feel that it should. One reason for that was I was listening to a debate on the radio yesterday where scientists were saying we'll decarbonize our energy systems by 2040, and he was talking globally, not just in the UK. But he said the stronger challenges will be farming and it will be transport. So I'd like to just sort of edge the debate into other areas, which is effectively is probably 2/3 of our carbon emissions. Thank you, panel.
Lovely. Right. Hands. Yep. There you go.
Thanks. Nathan Bennett from Renewable UK. I've got a question for Seb specifically. So I know the Conservative MPs are definitely convinced of the Conservative route for net zero. The voters certainly are. But it seems like the editors of Conservative leading press are less convinced. Is that a fair characterisation? And if so, how do we address it? Or am I kind of looking at them commissioning controversialist pieces for the benefits of pluralism of debate as something more sceptical than it is?
That's quite a good one.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about smart meters. I know there's been a rollout, but it's a little behind in the schedule, and I think it's an important part of the whole net zero strategy in terms of providing opportunities for people to provide flexibility resources, perhaps make a little money on peer-to-peer trading. So I'd like to know about, what do you think about regulation for that to enable that to happen?
Wonderful. Okay, so we'll try to get through those. So I think the first one we had about a little bit about nature-based solutions and climate action, farming emissions and transport. We had what's the media doing about climate change, and then smart meters and having control over your own energy. Right, Seb, should we go to you first? Because that was quite an obvious one. One for you.
Yeah, on the media one, great question. I think that obviously, but this comes back to my original point about how net zero is talked about at the moment. Because if you take the Daily Mail, to give a random example, if you were to say to the Daily Mail, would you like to write a piece about how many jobs are going to be created in Lancashire because of an offshore wind? That's a natural pro-Daily Mail story they would give a positive spin to, because it's the sort of thing they like. If you talk about the disruption and building works and dislocation and annoyed people about their backyards, they're going to write about it in a very different way. And what does worry me is that on the right, the net zero debate has gotten to a little bit of a funk at the moment, and I think that's what you see reflected in sort of conservative supporting newspapers. But I think it's not entirely lost as a battle, and I think the fact is I'd focus on the leadership of the Conservative Party pretty consistently. I wrote an essay in the FT about the kind of ups and downs of this, because of course the original person who was very, very environmentally conscious was Margaret Thatcher, who stood up at the UN in 1990 and made one of the first major speeches on climate change, prompted by Crispin Tickell, who was her advisor at that point. And she was very invested in what climate change was doing, partly, I think, because of her scientific background, but also partly because she could see the industrial advantages it would bring in the future because of this big transition that would be required. The party has gone through its ups and downs, shall we say, about the green crap, to use the phrase of a former prime minister. But I think the battle really in leadership terms has been won. And I think if you look at the left and the right of the party, there's only really people on the fringes who don't believe in climate change, who don't buy in to the net zero agenda. So in terms of MPs, I think they're all there. But as you always get with people in the parliamentary party. They have different priorities at different times. And this is why I think the rhetoric point is so crucial, because people are, of course, worried about the cost of living. They're, of course, worried about petrol prices and all that sort of thing. And too often net zero can be seen as a nice thing to have, a bit of icing on the cake, whereas it's not. It's absolutely germane to levelling up, to our economic future, to getting towards energy security and hopefully ultimately energy independence, so we become a net exporter in the future. That's the prize that renewables and nuclear can actually give to us at that point. So I'm confident that MPs are fully behind it, but I think in terms of the wider message, this is something everyone on the right needs to have to think about to win the arguments, so you don't get that kind of constant naysayism that does exist, I have to say, in some quarters.
Simon, are smart meters the ultimate net zero conservative technology, giving people ownership of their own energy use?
Well, are smart meters the ultimate anything? Well, I think they are actually, I think, an important manifestation of what we've been alluding to a few times today, which is community benefit, right? So it's a different form, it's individual benefit, but it's about trying to make sure that we are making it as straightforward as possible to do the right thing. I mean, that is, in a nutshell, I think what Conservatives ought to be seeking to achieve. And, you know, we are a party which fundamentally, and I'm channeling Graham Stewart here, is, you know, believes in aligning the incentives to deliver the outcome that you want. And smart meters are a very good way of showing that if you do your, you know, washing at a certain point, if you choose to turn the temperature down at a certain time, then there are direct benefits to that for you. And so, yes, they are about what this whole thing needs to be about, which is about creating a smart, intuitive, responsive market. And that is an incredibly ambitious undertaking, but it is one in which we, all of us, literally all of us, ought to be empowered to play a role, and smart meters are at the heart of that.
Anouka, we've heard that, you know, net zero is not just about energy. What about the other sectors, farming and transport? Anything else you care to throw in there?
Certainly. I'll just cover the whole of the economy, it'll be fine. So look, I think it's a really good point on farming and agriculture. And actually, one of the things that I was always really struck by was how forward-leaning the NFU are in particular on net zero. So kind of clearly the sector as a representative of it kind of gets it. The thing that I think is really interesting for us is agri-tech and the role that that kind of plays in this, because again, it's about kind of how do we do more with what we've got. The key there is kind of bringing down the upfront cost of buying some of that, and kind of how we utilise it, as well as kind of obviously using kind of the environmental land management scheme as well to try and get people to work together across boundaries, etc. So I think kind of tricky, but kind of some of the solutions are there and being picked up now. On transport, I actually think we've got quite a good headline policy. This isn't me kind of being defensive, but actually kind of if you look at the proportion of kind of emissions from transport, about half of them in the UK come from passenger cars. So actually that was the kind of logic and rationale behind kind of going for a 2030 date for ending the sale of kind of petrol and diesel vehicles, because it's such a huge part of that picture. And obviously for that, we had to take the manufacturers with us because, you know, unlike other countries that have done this, we actually have a kind of domestic manufacturing capability here. And so kind of ambition also means kind of not irritating those that are kind of bringing jobs at home. The kind of interesting bit will be kind of how do we ensure that carries through to public transport and kind of heavier goods vehicles. But I mean, the key thing to kind of watch out for is the zero emission vehicle mandate, which should be kind of hopefully coming out soon and kind of helps you kind of stagger that bit. Again, it's a regulatory bit, as well as kind of trying to bring manufacturers in. And then the other part, which wasn't mentioned, but is the kind of other bit, is homes and buildings, which is, I'd say, politically quite thorny. It was always the bit that kind of used to give me the biggest headache. I think I had to write the most notes on it. But it's kind of logical when you think about it, right? Because it's going into people's homes, not too dissimilar from the smart meter bit. But I think kind of the energy security debate and kind of prices have just changed a lot of that. So, you know, just anecdotally, people are saying, well, actually, like, how can I keep my bills down? And it's like, well, have you checked the energy efficiency of your home? And so kind of we're having that conversation now as a nation by the nature of just where prices are.
Yeah. And final thoughts on those few questions?
Just one response to the gentleman from North Yorkshire. you know, I'm in the electricity sector, that's my area of expertise, but I do think that hydrogen has some potential on that transport side. When I think aviation feels very difficult to crack, but you feel that a combination of electricity, and that may be one of the better uses of hydrogen. People talk about using hydrogen for every single thing in the world. We're going to have to find the best use for hydrogen, but that aviation could be one. I don't know how that's going to apply to your agricultural cow issue, but it will certainly help on that end. And just lastly, on the smart meters point, I think you get a lot of debate on big energy, small energy. We need all of it. Some people tell you that it's all going to be consumer-led. It isn't. But we're going to need a hell of a lot of consumer-led activity in there. We're going to need a lot of the stuff coming, which my company's more involved in the big kit as well.
Lovely. Well, I've run over time. Apologies to everyone. So just to close up this panel, I wonder if we could kind of go down the line and just a sentence on what you think a conservative route to net zero looks like. Hopefully we won't have the exact same answer, but if we do, then consensus, wonderful. So Anouka, we'll start with you and we'll go down the line.
It's a tech-first kind of private sector finance transition.
Wonderful.
It's making doing the right thing easy for me. That is easy and logical.
Okay.
And I guess I'm looking for a boring manifesto that deals with grid and planning issues, which may not come, but that's what I'd like to see.
Okay. And finally, Seb.
Making people's lives easier, more prosperous through technology and pragmatism.